Hello YouTube, this is Morgan Airspeed Prime here with my next Star Wars The Clone Wars episode review. This one's going to be for Season 7, Episode 5, Gone with a Trace. So finally we get introduced to Ahsoka in Season 7, and in The Clone Wars it's the first time we've seen Ahsoka since the end of Season 5. Hence the sort of recap bit here where they recapped why she left and so on, because it's been a while. If you haven't watched Season 5 in a while, you might be a little bit kind of confused about kind of what's going on here, because like Rebels has happened since then, the Ahsoka novels come out since then, and you know, this is our first Clone Wars time with Ahsoka in a very long time. I thought this episode was fine. I didn't think it was particularly incredible or anything like that. It wasn't bad, or I think I spent like all yesterday basically looking for a link to the episode. That's why I didn't get my review out yesterday. Finally found one this morning. I'm so glad Disney Plus is going to be launching over here next week, so I don't have to worry about that sort of stuff. But I did get to see a lot of people's reaction to this episode before I saw it myself. And I saw a lot of basically a mix between people saying this episode was very, very boring and just kind of a little bit pointless, and the other side of things being just like a lot of excitement about Ahsoka. I didn't end up seeing a lot of high praise for this episode. I think that's the main thing to say. I think the reason people are okay with this episode is because Ahsoka's in it. And I don't think Ahsoka being in this episode just makes it like good or really good by default. That is just, we care about a character we haven't seen in a while, and here she is back. And that was definitely good, but I think the problem with this episode as like the first episode of an arc is that it gave us like barely anything about, I think, what we really wanted out of this arc. In that, the way things are right now, you know, Season 7 is just 3 arcs. It was the Bad Batch arc, it's this Ahsoka walkabout arc, or whatever you want to call it, and then it's going to be the Siege of Mandalore arc. The Siege of Mandalore arc is going to be like the finale to the Clone Wars. It's going to be big, climactic action, you know, tying events in with Revenge of the Sith. This arc here is our opportunity to characterize Ahsoka. It's to explore her decision that she made at the end of Season 5 to not agree to come back and, you know, have to deal with what's going on. And I don't think this episode really did that much. There was one reference of Ahsoka to Anakin where she, you know, called him her big brother, which was very nice. A lot of people have pointed it out. That's a really nice thing of like who taught Ahsoka how to fight, you know, referencing Anakin. She uses the Force at the end, of course. And the only other scene you could really in any way add to Ahsoka's thoughts on the Jedi Order is just a scene where Trace gives her opinion on the Jedi Order. But Ahsoka just does her usual thing of sort of, you know, defending them, because of course she was involved in this. She knows that what Trace is saying isn't true because Trace doesn't have full context for like what exactly the Jedi are like required to do and so on. So it was a very like basic exploration of that plot point. And ultimately, this arc, that's what most people care about. The plot is ultimately this thing that is just there to sort of facilitate us getting Ahsoka's change in opinion on the Jedi Order. Exploring why she made her decision, why she's staying away, why she stayed away for so long, and what is potentially leading her to go back when the Siege of Mandalore comes up. And I'm just a little worried that it's going to take until basically Anakin, Obi-Wan, or whoever literally walks up to Ahsoka as like a civilian and sort of tells her about what's going on, we need you, and that's what just brings her back in. Which I think would be a very sort of boring way to do it. Like, it would be cool and all, teasing eventually the next meeting of those characters. But I think a lot of what we want out of this arc is for Ahsoka to come to some sort of conclusion on her own. And you can sort of see how they're going to get there with the plot that they brought up in this episode. Of, okay, it is Ahsoka who's previously from the, surface of Coruscant going down to the lower levels, 1313 in this case. Nice reference to a lot of incomplete Star Wars projects, but, ultimately it's just underworld, bad stuff happening, people in not great positions, and Ahsoka getting to experience that again, up close this time as someone who's also sort of dealing with it. And I suppose you're meant to read quite heavily into what Trace says about the Jedi, that from the normal civilian perspective, the Jedi aren't helping them. The tide is turning against the Jedi, and the people just see the Jedi as the ones sort of perpetuating the war, which obviously isn't the case, because of course we as viewers know the full context of the war is ultimately manipulated by Palpatine on both sides, and the Jedi, regardless of how the conflict is made, have to fight in it to protect the Republic. And because of how the war is going, they are required to put all of their resources into this because it is wartime. So, it gets into the idea of what for Trace would turn her opinion on the Jedi, because ultimately they're getting into this idea of okay, yes, the Jedi, I suppose, resolve conflicts like this, but the Jedi aren't police officers by default. They get more involved with diplomatic affairs between planets and organizations, rather than being down on the streets to stop thugs Trace had to deal with in this episode. So it feels a little bit like it was just a complaint about the Jedi Order without any real knowledge of the Jedi Order, and even though it was meant to be the main thing you look into, there wasn't a lot of substance to the criticism, I think. Which is why I don't think Ahsoka was led to talk all that much about it, because I think the show is getting a little lost in terms of what the Jedi's role actually is. And as far as we're aware, their role is to do stuff like we see at the start of Star Wars Episode 1, which is that Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon are sent out on a diplomatic mission to negotiate with the Trade Federation about the blockade on Naboo. It's this situation, they're meant to be peacekeepers. There's never really the implication that they are this other police force on Coruscant. If a similar type of situation arose on Coruscant, yes, maybe they would then get involved. And in general, they do get involved in some stuff like that, but that's more of a job for police, and it more speaks to the poor policing of the lower floors of Coruscant than anything. Which I think is the weakest part of this episode, is that it's basically 5% interesting Ahsoka thing. We finally seen Ahsoka after all this time, and then it's 95% just the plot of this episode, which is basically about Trace and Rafa, and Ahsoka just getting involved in this. It's just a typical underworld plot. Someone owes a guy with power money. She has to do weird stuff to get that money, which gets them further in debt. Trace is a more hopeful, optimistic character, whereas Rafa is maybe going down a slightly darker path, but still cares. And Ahsoka is going to help the two of them to sort of, I suppose, get out of this situation in some way. The thing here, though, is Ahsoka is going to have to deal with, what finally makes her decide that she needs to go back and help. I think it's just going to be the typical thing of Ahsoka is a hero as a character. She wants to help people in these sort of situations. She can't just sit back and do nothing. I suppose the normal people on Coruscant kind of have to do in these situations, or they'll get killed or whatever. Ahsoka has the power to sort of affect change. And while she's frustrated with the Jedi Order for what happened in her situation, she probably has to realize that within the Jedi Order, she can actually accomplish things and make a change for the better. And I think it's going to be something along that, which means that once again, this entire arc is going to hinge on how much the next 3 episodes focus on Ahsoka's inner thought process about what's going on, and then what they introduce into the arc by the end to bring Ahsoka into play for the final arc, rather than anything. In that, look, Trace and Rafa are fine as characters. The plot that's going on here is relatively basic. Like I said, it's the standard, like I said, get in too deep with the mob boss type plot. And Ahsoka as a hero comes in to try and sort that out. It's pretty basic stuff. What we're here for is Ahsoka, of course. So I hope episode 2, 3, and 4 of this arc understand that a little bit better. This was fine as a setup, but it definitely was really, really lacking. I was really surprised when the episode came to an end that, like, wow, like looking back at that whole episode, there's only like 2-3 moments in the entire episode, and they're relatively small, really getting in deep into like Ahsoka's situation here. And like I said, it was just who taught her how to fight. It's the nice reference of Anakin, older brother. You had her sort of back away from Trace when Trace tried to inquire a little bit more in depth about her, and Ahsoka, of course, wanting to stay away from that sort of action, and then her being called into action to use the Force when Trace was about to fall off with all the rampaging droids and so on. But again, they didn't make any real comment about that. Like, one kid saw her use the Force and sort of recognized it, but didn't say anything. So she's still sort of undercover. I don't know if that's going to come back in the future episodes to, like, out Ahsoka as being a Jedi. In that, like, even Trace doesn't know, of course, because she was, she couldn't see what Ahsoka was doing to save her. So, that reveal is going to have to come out in, like, I suppose the next episode or the third episode, that she is a former Jedi, can use the Force, and that might cause a little bit of conflict, which could be interesting. But we'll have to see exactly how that plays out. It's one of those ones where, like, I think it's probably a little bit too defensive for this episode to say that, oh, well, this episode was just a start. There's still 3 others to go. It's fine that this one didn't do much because the other episodes can do stuff. It feels a little bit like you're letting this episode away with not really doing much at all. I think this episode does deserve criticism for just being a little bit too plot-focused and not enough on the characters. This is an arc where it should be character-focused, and they went a bit too much into the plot. Because again, Rafa and Trace, I think, are going to be pretty much like exclusive to this arc. So they are more related to the plot rather than necessarily being, important characters themselves. They're just going to, like, facilitate Ahsoka undergoing some sort of a change. But again, we ultimately just want to see how Ahsoka gets from end of season 5 to coming back for the Siege of Mandalore. That's what we want to see. And I don't really think this episode highlighted anything along those lines. It's just that Ahsoka's here, she's friends with Trace now, she's sort of involved in what's going on. Things seem a little bit better, but Rafa still seems like she's going down the path of maybe getting involved in a few too many bad deals, and we'll see it probably go further awry as the episodes progress. I think that's, like, most of what I wanted to say about this episode. Like, visually, once again, like, this season has been, like, really, really good. The animation, especially when they had Ahsoka actually fight, they really turned up the animation to do some really crazy movement for Ahsoka. Like, the difference between the sort of brawler style that Trace had versus Ahsoka's, acrobatic style, where she's doing, like, breakdance moves, like, acrobatics all over the place. It was night and day. That was cool. The main action scenes here were, of course, like Ahsoka, her bike kind of failing as she falls through Coruscant, and then the rampaging kind of lifter droids later on, which, were fine. Not the most impactful fight scenes. We're, of course, waiting for more of the lightsaber stuff in the final arc, and then whatever they decide to do that's more actiony in this arc. It's definitely one of those episodes that sort of really brought this arc down to earth of, like, I think the expectations were, like, sky high from people with the return of Ahsoka, and outside of the fact that she is back, the actual, like, content of this episode was very much like, yeah, they didn't really deliver all that much, so hopefully that improves in the next 3 episodes. Because again, like, in a way, that's 5 episodes of the Clone Wars out of 12. Final season. And it still feels like we haven't properly got going yet. Because the first arc we've seen already. Very few changes. It was good, but it didn't really feel like a finale arc. The Return of Ahsoka arc, one episode in, doesn't really feel like a finale arc either. And I think this is what's going to, I think, maybe affect Season 7 looking back on it, is that in the planning of the Clone Wars, there were meant to be multiple arcs dealing with Ahsoka away from the Jedi Order. Whereas we have to cram all of that into one and have it work before she comes back. And I'm kind of worried that that's not quite working, and that they might not have been better off like not doing the Bad Batch arc and maybe doing something slightly different with these Ahsoka episodes and bringing in the Ventress arc, bringing in the Maul arc, especially if Siege of Mandalore is not going to explain how Maul is back. Those type of things are going to really, really flare up as being kind of problems with episode selection of what they chose to do this season. I hope that doesn't end up being the case, but I absolutely understand the perspective that some fans have of, we're nearly halfway through the season, and I don't think there's been a particularly incredible episode just yet. When arguably they get to choose 12 episodes from all of the arcs that they had set up. These 12 episodes should all be pretty incredible, but they kind of haven't been so far. So, I think it is going to be one of those things, regardless of how the remaining 7 episodes go, there will be calls for more Clone Wars, I think, for sure. People will want the extra plot points of Ventress and Maul to be covered in animation. They'll want more Ahsoka stuff to fill in some of the gaps that will probably still be left here covered. And they're going to have to, we're going to have to see how they deal with that. Of course, we have the recent rumors that potentially Ahsoka has been cast for The Mandalorian Season 2. I don't know if it's 100% confirmed, but the way it's being spread around, it seems like it is pretty much confirmed. So we'll see how exactly that works out, and that they're committing to doing Ahsoka stuff. So we'll see how that goes. But after all the hype, setup, having to wait a whole arc for Ahsoka, this was honestly, it was a little bit of a letdown. The episode, like I said, was fine, but I can't really say it's more than that. It's not incredible. It wasn't, I think, super weak, but I can see why so many people saw this episode and immediately just went, disappointing, let's see what happens next week. Because there's not a lot to discuss from this one, really. We'll have to wait and see for it to finally get going in the next week or two. But there are my thoughts on the episode. In the comment, let me know what your thoughts are on this episode. But that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.